Hello everybody and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for a brand new video. This time we'll talk about Entity Framework Core, and we had already a bunch of different videos on EF Core where we covered basic topics like how to get started with the connection strings and things like that. We have also covered very fundamental topics like how to create one-to-one relationships, one-to-many relationships, and of course many-to-many relationships, and that's in fact what we see on the screen right now. This is how we configure the many-to-many relationship here in this OnModelCreating class. But now I want to go one step further in our journey of understanding how EF Core works. And today I would like to talk about overriding conventions, because Entity Framework Core is all about conventions. And that's easy, especially if you're at the beginning stage of your career, because you can just simply go ahead and write your classes, like for instance we did with this author class. And for instance, just if we look at the first property, there is already a convention. Because if the class is called author, and if we have a property of type int that is called author ID or simply ID, then EF Core will simply take it and consider it as a primary key. But for instance, what happens if you want to use another naming convention? For instance, you would like to use AID, like this should be shorter. Now in this case, if we do a migration, the problem is that EF Core won't know exactly what to do, because it will say that we don't actually have a primary key for our entity. And this is one instance where we would like to override the conventions that we have in EF Core. And if we look at the other properties, for instance, like this public string first name, public string last name, what EF Core will do when it will create the tables, it will make all these fields or all these columns basically in the table nullable. But what if we don't want to make them nullable? So we want it necessarily when you create or when you want to write a new author in the database, it should necessarily have a first name and a last name. So in this case, once again, we would need a way to override conventions, or to override the conventions that we have by default in EF Core. Now there are actually two ways to override conventions in EF Core. And the first way that we will gonna take a look at is simply by using attributes. So if we decorate our properties with data annotations, Entity Framework will look at those attributes and will try to override the convention based on that specific attribute. And let's give an example here. So let's go here, and just above this property, let's add this key attribute, which should specify that this should be considered as the primary key. And in fact, if we go here on the key, of course, we don't have the library installed. So what we need to do is simply using system component model data annotations, and this should actually work. So right now, if we want to add a migration, we will probably see that right now this property can be considered as the primary key, because we have marked it or we have decorated it, actually, to be more specific, with this key attribute. And we could do the same way, for instance, here for this first name, we can just say, okay, this first name is required. So that's it. Entity Framework Core will take note about our desire to override the convention, and will mark this property and the corresponding column name as required. And we could do actually the same for this last name, and that should be it in this case. So let's go to the package manager console and try to add a migration. Add migration, sorry for the typos. And let's call this migration override author conventions. And let's add this migration. And yeah, right now it says that build succeeded. Okay, if you take a look into this migration, what happens is that of course it first drops the foreign key, it drops the primary key, it drops the column, and it basically recreates them. For the last name, we see that the column gets altered, so it gets changed actually. And we see here that nullable is false. So right now, this column last name won't be nullable anymore. So we will necessarily have to provide a value for it. And the same thing will go for the first name. And then we see that we re-add the column, which is right now called AID, in this table authors. And this time, if we look at the add primary key, we see that we add this column, or we specify this column as a primary key. So this is how we have overridden these standard conventions that we have in EF Core using attributes. And once again, this is only one way to override conventions. Now let's go back to the book class and let's think about this book further. So in this case, what we would like to do is also change the naming convention here. We would like to use BID. Not that this is necessarily a best practice, but I just want to do is to show how we can override the standard EF Core conventions in a different way. And then we have this string title and string description, and we also want to mark them as required. So how do we do that if we are not using data annotation attributes? Well, we can do this, probably you've guessed, in the DB context class. So if we go in this app DB context and here in this OnModelCreating, we can basically specify exactly how we actually want to map our model to the database using this very nice and standard way of using methods that actually describe exactly the actions that we want to take. And this is actually everything very fluent, and this is why this configuration, or this way of configuring EF Core models, is called also the Fluent API. So we can do this very easily by adding here a new part where we say builder, and we want to define our entity. Of course, to do that, I also need to do this correctly, and the entity would be book in this case. And of course, there's still a typo here. Let's remove it. Okay, so we have this new entity that we want to configure here, which is book right now. So the first thing that I want to say is has key, and here let's give this lambda b from book, and we see that the key should be the property BID. And this is the way how we actually define or tell to EF Core that we want to use this property as the primary key. And now we also have to do some other thing, builder entity, and it's actually the same entity. It's then book, of course, and it should be okay, but this is a method. And then what we can do here is property, and we specify the property that we want to use here. And this property should be, in this case, the property that is first name, I guess. So it should be, but let's do it like that. So it should be property, and here let's say first name for book, and then book dot first name. Sorry, this is a book. This has a title, so it doesn't have a first name. And then what we can do here is we can chain this together and say that is required. And this is the way that we tell EF Core that this property title should be required. And we can of course do the same thing, but let's maybe copy paste. It's not the best practice, and I really don't encourage you to do that. But to not keep this video so long, we just say here that the property description and then this property is required. So we have configured right now our book entity, and we have overwritten the standard conventions by using this Fluent API. So let's add a migration, add migration, and let's call this migration modify or override book conventions. And let's okay, build failed. Seemingly I have an error somewhere, probably. Okay, of course I have then right now a problem in my controllers, because I don't have a book ID anymore. I have this one, and sorry, it's BID from book. So yeah, right now everything should be fine. So let's go back to my DB context and let's try to add this migration again. Now build succeeded, and right now we see that a new migration was created. Let's take a brief look into it. And here we see that, okay, we dropped the foreign key for the book author, we dropped the primary key because we want to recreate them, we dropped the column that was previously called ID, which is okay. Then we alter the column's title and description, and we make them non-nullable. So right now they are required, just like we defined in that configuration in the OnModelCreating class, method. And then of course we add the column, which is called BID to books, and we make this as the primary key. And of course then we re-add the previous foreign key. So I would say that this migration actually is correct. So just to make a short summary about this, once again, if you want to override the standard EF core conventions, there are two main ways to do that. The first way is to simply use data annotations attributes. And if you use them, they will override the conventions. The second way to do that is simply not do nothing actually in the model itself, but configure the entity in the OnModelCreating method using this EF Core Fluent API. And right now, before we wrap up, there is only one very important thing that we still have to add here. When Entity Framework Core tries to create the model, it basically goes from one step to the other of overriding the convention. So first of all, EF Core tries to simply use the standard conventions to model those specific entities that we want to have in the database. So if it doesn't see any attributes, like for instance here, then the next step is to look in the OnModelCreating. And if Entity Framework Core doesn't see any configuration for that specific entity in this OnModelCreating, then it will go on and actually use those standard conventions. But please bear in mind, it is always this order. So first EF Core tries to use the standard convention, then it tries to look if we have decorated our properties with some data annotations, and last but not least, it tries or it looks here in this OnModelCreating method to see if we have any Fluent API configuration. And the order is always this. And this is important because if we have, like for instance, this model, where we have decorated our properties with attributes, if we would, for instance, go here in the appdb context and mark those as not required, then what we do here in the Fluent APIs, or what we do in this OnModelCreating method, will override actually what we did here when we annotated our properties. So this is very important to note, that here everything that you have configured here in this OnModelCreating method will override both the standard conventions, but also the attributes that you used to decorate your properties with. So this is why it's important to always keep in mind this flow that the EF Core uses. First, it checks the conventions, or it tries to follow the conventions. Then it checks if you have annotated your properties. And last but not least, it checks here what configurations do you have in this OnModelCreating method. And if you have any configurations, it will apply them no matter the standard conventions and no matter the attributes that you used to decorate your properties with. So yeah, that's basically it. That's how you can override standard conventions in EF Core. If you did enjoy this content, please don't be shy and hit the thumbs up button. If you didn't subscribe to this channel, then please don't miss the opportunity and hit the subscribe button. It will be very, very much appreciated and I would be grateful and thankful to you. And of course, last but not least, if you know people, if you have friends that you know that that could benefit of watching this video, please don't be shy and feel free to share this content with them, either on your social network or directly. Just let them know that there might be out there on the internet some content that might be useful for them. This being said, once again, thank you very, very much for watching. And until the next time, I wish you the very, very best and stay safe.